What is up, guys? We are back again with another episode of the podcast. And on today's episode, we are not joined by Gary. Gary is off doing some doctoring stuff. I think he's on placement. So instead, we've decided to get someone who has been on the podcast before. So those of you who are regular listeners, you've probably heard him speak. But he is here to help us answer the questions we have around, or to discuss, I suppose, the questions we have around this whole exercise and health exercise or medical exercise series that we're doing, because there's a few things related specifically to sarcopenia, muscle mass, and older age, which I think he is very well positioned to talk about. So Richie, maybe you'll let people know who you are, what you do, and why you're someone that could potentially help us with these kind of questions we have about this stuff.
Just out of curiosity, am I well positioned to talk about this because I'm old? Was that the gag that you were getting?
Well, I didn't really want to bring that up, but yeah, like, there's a bit of grain around the edges,
right in there. Hello. I'm Richie. I'll tell you what I do. I'm doing a PhD in Liverpool John Moores University, and my area of research focuses on the role of muscle mass in reducing risk of cardiac events in people who've already had a cardiac event, so secondary prevention. Hopefully I'll be finished with that very soon. As I was chatting with you earlier, this week would be great because I'm done with it mentally.
The end, you see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's almost there,
Hopefully it's not going to be a train. So
yeah, well, that's always the hope. So yeah, as you can imagine, Richie is someone that is very well positioned to discuss this stuff because he's actually involved in a few different areas that we talk about a lot with regard to, we'll say, heart health. We'll call it that kind of stuff. It's like, we talk about heart disease a lot on the podcast. He's also well positioned to talk about the more muscle mass related stuff, the strength related stuff, and obviously sarcopenia. Again, we'll talk about that, what that means and all that kind of stuff in a second. So you're very well positioned to talk about this stuff, right? But what are we actually talking about, right? So the thing about this is, and we talked about it in the last podcast, and for those of you who listened to it, we talked about the role of exercise in health and longevity, and one of the things that you see consistently in the research is that, well, to an extent, higher levels of muscle mass are protective, right? Higher levels of strength are protective. And what are they protective of? Well, they're protective of health and longevity, And we've talked about it a few times previously on the podcast, there is this little bit of a delineation between, lifespan and health span, and lifespan being like the number of years in your life, and health span being the, like, we'll call it the quality of those years. And exercise, strength, muscle mass all seem to get both. They seem to be one of the few things that seem to target both. You see certain drugs, certain interventions, certain protocols, maybe they improve the quality of your life, but they don't necessarily include or increase the quantity of your life, right? Or vice versa. You might see things that increase the quantity of your life, but you're looking at that intervention and going, Jesus, the quality of my life would probably be severely impacted by doing that, right? But exercise seems to be one that improves the quality of your life and improves the quantity of your life, right? So, Richie, what's the story here? What's the story with muscle mass and strength? How is this playing a role in health and longevity? Like, what's going on here?
Wow, broad question. We do see a lot of associations between muscle mass, and not just muscle mass, like muscle strength itself and muscle function seems to be quite well associated with a longer life and a better quality of life. And there are a few reasons from that. If we just go with the quality of life stuff first, so this is kind of getting into an area that I'm relatively new to myself, which is qualitative research. And just for anybody who's not familiar, like with science, we have quantitative research and we've got qualitative research. And quantitative research is all to do with numbers. So, you can, I'll do a study and I'll be able to get some numbers at the end of it, say, okay, muscle mass increased by this much, muscle strength increased by this much, cholesterol dropped by this. Okay, and that gives me a nice number, and I can say, okay, this causes this to drop by whatever percent. Beautiful, lovely numbers.
And that's the stuff that most people would think of as a scientist. They'd be like, scientist, they quantify things. It's like,
exactly,
measure this, how much of this, whatever.
but now, and it's starting to become more popular, and for good reason. There's qualitative research, which some people will look at as the kind of airy fairy hippy dippy kind of side of things, because what we're doing is we're asking about feelings and experiences, and we want to ask people, how are you doing, how did that feel, etc. What do you think of this? And for scientists who are used to numbers, that's like, oh god, what am I supposed to do with that? It's really, really important, because, as you said, quality of life is important. And just to give an example, we're doing a research study at the moment where we're actively trying to get people who've had a cardiac event to increase their muscle mass. And some of the qualitative data that we've received from this so far has been fantastic, because one thing that everybody has said so far is that their confidence has increased. And you ask why? And well, these people have had a cardiac event, and that's going to, knock you for six, and you're going to suddenly feel like, God, what has happened to my life? Can I do this? Can I do that? I'm not sure if I'm going to be alive in 6 months' time. These people feel more confident about every aspect of their life that we've spoken about. They feel more confident in their work, because they can go to work more confidently. They're getting compliments from their friends. They feel like they are more capable of doing daily chores. And while like doing the daily chores themselves is an important fact, and when I say that, like being able to get out of bed easily in the morning, be able to stand up from a chair, being able to play with your grandkids, put the groceries away, carry your groceries, those are things that are really important to do. But also the feeling that I'm able to do that when previously I wasn't, or I was less able to do that, that's a huge thing for how people feel. And that's important for us as scientists to look into, because it's great to say these numbers are fantastic, but if somebody is putting on more muscle and has put on like 3 kilos in the last 12 weeks, and they're stronger and their cholesterol is better, but they feel like absolute shit, what good is it? Like it's you're increasing lifespan, but not necessarily health span, or at least you're not their quality of life. But another aspect of that, then
just on that, like you see a lot of research that they'll talk about a specific protocol. For example, like I'm just thinking of one, I was actually reading it earlier on because I was rehashing some thoughts that I had. It was on like increasing VO2 max, and there's this protocol that they basically did, which was on and off days. So one day you would do like high intensity intervals, and the next day you'd do like continuous cardio. So you could say it's more aerobic, but they basically got them to run as fast as they could, so it's not really aerobic. And they basically just alternated those days, and they did it for 10 weeks, right? And that paper showed the highest, as far as I'm aware at least, highest increase in VO2 max in anyone, right? But then when they asked the people like, oh, are you going to continue with this? Like, I'm pretty sure every single one of them was like, no, I'm not going to continue with this. This is so draining. Like, there's no way I could continue with this beyond the 10-week mark, So like, you might be someone like a quantitative absolutist, being like, all that matters is, the data, all that matters is like the actual figures, the facts, whatever. But if we ignore the quantitative stuff, the qualitative stuff, like, it's actually useless. Like, we're talking about the real world. Like, yeah, cool, we want to know the best protocols in a lab or in a clinical setting or whatever. Like, I want my doctor to be like, right, look, this chemotherapeutic is going to be fucking awful for you, but you only need to be on it for 3 months or whatever. I'm like, okay, look, there's a trade-off there. It's the best one for the job, etc. Right? But if we're talking about stuff that people have to do for the rest of their life, I want some qualitative. I want to know how they felt. I want to know what that actually did to them in terms of how they felt day to day, in terms of how they felt about themselves, etc.
No, absolutely, because you need to know if somebody's going to continue with that, and like that's one of the questions that we have for our end point interview is, are you going to continue? Do you think you will continue with A, this exercise, B, this diet? And so far, from everybody that we've had who's finished their 12 weeks, it's like yes, but not just yes, it's yes, definitely. They all say they enjoy the program. And look, I will say, like, I designed the program, and I designed it specifically to be, one, simple, and to be game-like, just like, as in, the whole goal is kind of eventually to progress with the weights, and this is how you progress with the weights. And we know gamifying things makes them a little bit more enjoyable, but they've all loved it. They've loved getting stronger. They've loved seeing the weights going up and increasing with what they're doing. And then with the diet, they all seem really, really happy with it as well. And again, that's how you structure the diet. You don't like, you can give somebody the strictest diet in the world for 3 months in a metabolic ward study, and you can say, here, follow this, this will happen. And you can be absolutely right. But then you say, are you going to follow this? And you go out, like, fuck no, like that was horrendous. I don't ever want to eat like that again. But they're happy doing what we're doing because it's not overly strict. It's just some simple changes to their diets to make it, you know, more conductive to what we want to happen with our research. But that said, so obviously we're doing the qualitative side, and the qualitative side is really, really important. I'm not going completely airy-fairy, and we are still looking at the quantitative stuff. So we are looking at muscle size, we are looking at strength, we are looking at blood lipids and other aspects of cardiometabolic health as well. And like on that side, like kind of getting back to your original question, which was like about, you know, 2 weeks ago, why does muscle size, why does muscle strength contribute to health? Then we can also look at, like, I think one of the better aspects in metabolic health that's researched is actually the relationship between muscle size and blood sugar control. And we know that not only muscles, like larger muscles, but also healthier muscles. So those are generally muscles that are more active, muscles that have less intramuscular fat within them, and those are usually muscles that are exercised regularly, are healthier. They are much more efficient at taking up glucose from our bloodstream when we eat glucose, and we get one of those dreaded glucose spikes that everybody's terrified of, which are, you know, perfectly normal. But it does help us to maintain and manage blood glucose much more effectively. And this is why exercise is so good for people who are suffering from type 2 diabetes. So we see that there is an association between higher levels of muscle mass and strength. And insulin sensitivity, so the ability to actually use insulin to take up glucose from our bloodstream. So that's let's say the diabetes side of things. In the cardiac side of things, so there is a very, very nice association between muscle size and cardiac outcomes. And there seems to be, you've probably heard of the obesity paradox, and like there's an obesity paradox in many different areas of kind of health science. But one of them in cardiac health is, if you look at a cardiac population, you'll often see that the people with higher BMIs tend to live longer than those with a lower BMI to a certain extent. And the reason for that, well, one of the reasons we think that is because those with a higher BMI also tend to have higher levels of muscle mass. And if you kind of stratify this according to people with, let's say, low levels of muscle and then high levels of fat, or low levels of fat and then higher levels of muscle, low levels of fat, higher levels of fat, those who seem to be the least healthy are the ones with the lowest levels of muscle and the lowest levels of fat. And you can obviously see, okay, there's some association with frailty there. But then, you know, higher levels of muscle in general tend to be associated with much higher levels of basically surviving and living longer if you've had one of these conditions. And we're not 100% sure why that is. We do think that it can potentially be down to some of the, what we call anti-inflammatory cytokines that are produced by muscle. So they're also known as myokines. And so these are signaling molecules that are produced by muscle when we exercise. And they can have, you know, multiple different effects on, you know, inflammation throughout the body. And we do know that inflammation is very, very much associated with heart health, particularly things like atherosclerosis. But what we looked at in our research, not the interventions that we're doing at the moment, is we did something called a Mendelian randomization study recently. And for anybody who's not familiar, Mendelian randomization is basically a way of carrying out a very, very, very large scale RCT, but by using population data when we have access to their genes and we know what those genes can do. So what we can do is we can look at different levels, people with different levels of muscle, and we can see what effect does that have on different, in our case, we wanted to have a look at lipoproteins, so things like cholesterol. And specifically, we looked at LDL cholesterol, we looked at HDL cholesterol, and we looked at VLDL cholesterol. And we found that there wasn't any association between muscle and LDL cholesterol, but there was an association with the size of HDL and the size of VLDL. And potentially, what we think is that, you know, larger muscle actually muscle strength, because we looked at grip strength as well, tends to be associated with a larger a HDL particle size and a smaller VLDL particle size, which again now this is all quite speculative at the moment, but it's kind of giving us some ideas to work on for mechanisms. But it's giving us an idea that, okay, these different particles, like for example, we know that larger HDL may actually be associated with better what's called cholesterol efflux and the ability to retransfer cholesterol from the peripheral tissues to our body. So basically getting cholesterol out of our bloodstream. And VLDL, for some reason, we think that smaller VLDL particles are actually associated with better metabolic health, or at least an indicator of better metabolic health. So that's one potential way that it can affect heart health. Then there's other aspects of life. So for example, like we know that people who have larger muscle mass and stronger muscles tend to have better bone health, which is hugely important. So they have a lower risk of osteoporosis, and that's because muscles impact our bones. So every time our muscles move, they do create a small sensation stimulus for our bones, which causes regeneration of bones. And that's why, some strength athletes tend to have exceptionally high bone density. Coupled with that, we know that stronger muscles are associated with a lower risk of falling. And why might that be is because, well, when people get older, we do know that people lose muscle. We'll talk about that a little bit later, hopefully. As people get older, they tend to lose type 2 fibers, and people will associate type 2 fibers with quick reactionary movements. So if you've lost those type 2 fibers as you get older, and you stumble or you fall or you slip, those reactionary muscles that would normally restabilize us and stop us from hitting the ground are not there. So we have a greater chance of hitting the ground. You have a greater chance of hitting the ground, and you've got osteoporosis from having low bones, from low muscle mass. You've got a greater chance of fracturing something when you hit the ground. And we see that people with lower levels of muscle mass have a higher fracture risk. And we know that if somebody fractures something like their hip, they've got a much greater elevated risk of dying in the next 6 months. So again, there's another way. There's aspects of cognitive performance that seem to be enhanced by having larger levels of muscle. And then even back to the quality of life side of things, there are high levels of depression in people who have lower muscle mass. And while I'm very skeptical about saying it's directly related, I would say that if you have lower levels of muscle mass and you're more likely to be frail, you're less likely to be able to do things that you like doing or that you want to do. You're less likely to be able to be a productive member of society. You're less likely to be able to go out and go down to the pub and meet your friends, because you might be stuck in a bed all the time. And that is not going to have a good effect on your mental health. So there are multiple different ways that our muscle mass and strength can impact health in general. So I hope that has somehow answered the question that you answered.
Much everything I was gonna go on to. So that was a fantastic, nice, thorough job. Now, obviously, look, there's entire bodies of literature written on this stuff. Like if you're really interested in this, you can go down the rabbit hole and you can look at different signaling pathways and different little mechanisms and whatever else, right? But exercise seems to be one of those, especially when we talk about like the actual adaptations to exercise. Like we've talked about this before on the podcast, but you kind of can dissociate or pull apart the two things. Like the actual act of exercise seems to be pretty good, right? Seems to be pretty good for a variety of things, especially on the metabolic side, right? You could also say on the social side, like getting out, talking to some people, etc., right? The adaptations from exercise, they also seem to be beneficial, right? So we kind of have this interplay where just doing something, even if it's not that great, is probably a good thing, right? But if we can design a training program, design a lifestyle intervention, whatever, that actually leads to better outcomes in terms of like increased strength, increased muscle mass, increased whatever, or decreased in some cases, right? If we can design that, happy days, because the actual outcomes are also what we're looking for. However, it's one of those things where you can't really pull it apart. Like you need to do the exercise to get the adaptations, but I always want to say that or make that known, because people often get really inside their own head where they're like, oh, well, I don't know the exact perfect protocol for how to build muscle, or the exact perfect protocol to increase my VO2 max, or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, well, just do something, because that's associated with benefits in and of itself, right? So either way, you've answered a lot of there, or you've brought up a lot in terms of why exercise seems to be a panacea. And we obviously related it back to the strength and muscle side of things. Now, I personally have a bit of a gripe, and I said this to you before the podcast. A lot of the research in sarcopenia seem to measure calf size, right? what the fuck is up with that? Are they just trying to troll me here? Because I have literally no calves whatsoever. I know a lot of the listeners of the podcast are in a similar position. Richie, I'm pretty sure you don't have massive calves yourself, you know?
I take offense to that. Are you basing that on what you see in this? Yeah, they're tiny.
You know?
They're
Anyway,
barely there. It's just like literally it's my knees and then it's my ankles. So.
it's literally a bone. That's it, you know? So what's the story there? It seems that a lot of researchers are obsessed with measuring calf size as a proxy for overall muscle mass, right? First of all, I have a question around that in terms of how do we actually decipher like what muscle, like how are we measuring muscle mass and how are we relating that back to like health, sarcopenia, or whatever? Like, what are you doing when you go in? You're like, right, we want to look at the functional outcomes. We want to look at the quantitative stuff. I'm like, how are you measuring muscle mass? Is it better to use like a DEXA scanner? Whatever. Talk a little bit about that. But then I have a second question, and that is, am I just doomed to die early? Because if they measure my calves and they compare it to the population, right, they're gonna go, geez, this guy's fucking severely under muscled. You know, he's like, you know, we need to intervene right now, you know? So am I just doomed to sarcopenia and dying early because my calves are tiny? Or is it a case of the more important thing is not looking at like comparing yourself to the population, but rather comparing yourself to where you were?
Your calves are small, Paddy. It's just not looking good for you right now. Okay, right. There were a lot of questions in there. You're going to have to guide me back as we go along. So first off, calves in the research. So I was saying this to you before we started. I have seen very little research that talks about calves. I like now in retrospect, I do recall some. I'm going to kind of answer this with a question. Why is BMI so commonly used as a metric for health these days?
Because it's quick and easy.
Because it's quick and easy, and it is super quick and easy to take somebody's waist measurement, super quick and easy to take somebody's height, to take somebody's body weight. It's really easy to get a little tape measure, throw it around somebody's calf and say, there you go, 12 inches or whatever a calf measurement goes for.
Happy with that.
So like you said, a lot of this research comes out of Japan as well. And as I was saying to you earlier, there's a huge amount of sarcopenia research coming out of Japan. And the reason for that is because they've got a massively aging population. And they're like, okay, this is going to be this is a major problem for us right now. We need to start looking into this. But the thing with calves, or focusing on any particular one muscle, it's not particularly useful for comparing between individuals. So you can't say that, like, you know, like yourself with, you know, your 3-inch calves and like somebody else who's got like a 12-inch calf, is one of these guys healthier than the other? You can't really say that. What I would say is information like that is possibly useful if we've got longitudinal data. So if we've got like somebody who takes a measurement in the year 2000 and then in the year 2022 they take another measurement, and or, you know, hopefully maybe every 10 years, and we can say, okay, so this person has managed to actually maintain their calf size over those 20 years, and this person, we're seeing a considerable decline in that calf size. And then we can also look at other factors that person might be experiencing. So we might see that people who are losing that calf size, they've also got a greater risk of diabetes or heart disease or whatever number of conditions. So that's where it could be useful. But on its own, it's not a particularly useful metric. Okay, it's useful for looking at big populations longitudinally, and that's what I would say something similar about, you know, BMI. It has its uses for within big populations. But how do we actually do it in the lab? And there are a few ways of doing it. So at the moment, the standard definition for sarcopenia is, or for how to diagnose sarcopenia, there's different guidelines worldwide, and there's nothing that's universally accepted. But the one that we mostly use here in Europe and often in the United States is from the European Working Group on Sarcopenia in Older People, which is a title that absolutely rolls off the tongue. They've got a set of criteria, and it's based on two things. So it's based on a measure of muscle function, and that can be like a timed up and go test, for example, or grip strength, which is what we like to use in our research, and also on skeletal muscle mass, and particularly appendicular lean mass is what we like to look at. So in our research, and what we do is we use two different machines for measuring muscle mass. We use a DEXA, which is often considered one of the gold standard machines. I think personally MRI is better, but DEXA is quite good. And then we also use a bioimpedance analysis machine, so BIA, and that just uses electric currents. And to be honest, for looking at an individual, I think they're quite good as well. There may be discrepancies if you're trying to compare people, but if we're looking at individuals, I think BIA is absolutely fine if you've got a good machine. And what we're looking at is we're looking for appendicular muscle mass. So we want to see the muscle that's actually on the appendices, so on the arms and on the legs. And the reason I like to look at that is because you can associate that muscle with levels of exercise and the effects of the outcomes of, let's say, a resistance exercise trial. So for example, you hear people talking about like fat-free mass all the time. And fat-free mass is basically anything that's not fat in your body, and it can be at any part of your body. So it can be within your torso here. And when you think about it, within our torso, we've got a huge amount of organs as well. Organs can increase and decrease in size, and they can actually increase and decrease in size in response to protein as well. But that's not muscle mass, but it often gets thrown in with it. So that's why I like to look at appendicular lean mass, the actual muscle that's on your appendices, because if you're doing a resistance exercise program, you are probably very specifically trying to increase those muscles. So the muscles in your legs, the muscles in your arms. Now, obviously, your posterior chain gets trained as well, but it's much harder to quantify. So it's easier to say, okay, this guy's appendicular muscle mass has increased, by 2 or 3 kilos over the last few months. This is a good outcome. Whereas if we've got fat-free mass changes, we might not see anything significant, or we might see something significant, and clinically it's not significant at all. So we do that. We use DEXA and we use the BIA to do it as well. And we use hand grip strength as our measure of strength. Now, I have issues with hand grip strength because I don't think it is, there's good research that shows that hand grip strength and changes in hand grip strength are associated with better health outcomes. So if you've got stronger hand grip strength, you're probably going to live longer. That's fair enough. I think other measures like we can use machines that actually measure the kind of force that somebody would exert if they were doing a deadlift. I think if we could do that a little bit more regularly, that might even be more useful. But at the moment, hand grip, because it is very quick, very easy to do, it is become one of the gold standard strength tests. So that's what we're using at the moment as well. So that was one of the questions you asked. Oh, I have forgotten. I knew I would.
I'll bring you back. Don't worry. But it just brings up a really important point. And this is something that if you're a researcher, especially, you need to be aware of. But if you are someone that is also just trying to interpret research, and this is the fact that oftentimes we're looking at proxy measures. We're not actually looking at what we want to look at. And this is important because, like, I bring up the calves, for example, because you'll see people online talking about longevity, and they'll read research like this and they go, oh, this means that you have to do more calf work because having bigger calves is going to lead to better outcomes. And you can start thinking about that, and then you can start making these kind of functional hypotheses about why this might be the case. You might be like, well, the calves are important because you do a lot of walking, the calves get worked in walking, so maybe if you're keeping more calf mass, it means it's kind of a proxy for general activity. Then you can also make these other inferences and go, well, like contraction is kind of how you get lymph moving. So if you're contracting the lower limb, you're getting more lymphatic drainage, you're getting more lymph move around the body. So there's all these different things. Like, you see people come up with the most crazy potential mechanism for why it is. And look, it might be the case, same with hand grip strength. Like, people are like, oh, hand grip strength, like I need to train my grip so that I have improved hand grip strength so that in my older age, like I'll live longer effectively, right? And a lot of these markers are actually just proxy markers, right? They're not actually telling us what we want to know, but there's actually no way to tell us what we want to know. You're like, for example, if you're like, oh, I want to see the actual amount of muscle changed, the actual amount of fat mass changed. There's no real way to know that unless we're able to autopsy you, and I don't think anyone's signing up for that, So, like, we have to use proxy measures, and then we have to try not to fall victim of glorifying that proxy measure, because it's just a proxy measure. Like you said, like, if you use a DEXA scan, it's like, oh, cool, we're measuring like lean mass or something, like, or if you use any other thing it's just telling you the lean mass, like, it's not really telling you a huge amount. And a lot of research on like sports and we'll call it sports nutrition, right? They fall victim of this where they'll do an intervention where they'll like restrict someone, and like DEXA is a good one, where they'll carbohydrate restrict someone and then do this like carbohydrate load, and all of a sudden their lean mass goes up by like 3 kilos, and they're like, look, see, but it's water weight. It's not telling you like you didn't actually gain 3 kilos of muscle, And then you also see this in like even like longevity research as well, where they'll like do like caloric restriction on a mouse or whatever, and then they'll feed it more, and they'll be like, look, it gained like whatever this much, or it lost this much lean mass or whatever. And it's not actually looking at the organ mass that it lost or the organ mass that it gained back again. It's like, it's very hard to be perfect with your measurements with the tools that we have, let's say it that way. So I always encourage people not to get too caught up in the actual measurements that we're using. They're just proxies a lot of the time, at least. So we actually care about the functional outcomes at the end of it. Like, oh, we saw an increase in muscle mass even with our poor tools for this, and it seems to be correlated with better health. Okay, cool. Let's see if we can refine our measurements. Let's see if we can refine, like I would it would be fantastic. Well, maybe not for calves, but if there was another muscle group and it was like, all you have to do was train this one muscle group, and that's going to lead to better longevity. Or like the grip strength, if it's like, oh, we just have to train our grip and we're going to live forever. Like, I'm going to be fucking great. I have Viking's disease. So my grip is already like fucking 5 times better than everyone else's. So I'm going to live forever, apparently, So anyway, look, that's just one thing that I like to often bring up, that it's, don't get too caught up in the proxy measures. We're actually looking at the functional outcome. But anyway, to bring it back, right? To answer my question personally, am I doomed to die because of sarcopenia, or to die of sarcopenia earlier because of my low calves? And I'm going to presume, based on what you've told me, no.
Probably not.
Right, but anyway,
you're grand. Look, and here's the thing: like you go in, you train regularly. I know you like to hit the biceps and stuff like that. The fact that your calves are not matching up to the rest of the physique really doesn't matter, because you're fit, you're healthy in other ways and other aspects. Like, focusing on one muscle it's just the silliest thing in the world.
Unless you're a bodybuilder, because then
unless you're a bodybuilder, but like
it's a low percentage of the individuals. But anyway, this does bring me to my next kind of question, right? And this is a bit of a thought experiment, right? Or a case study, I suppose you could say, right? And this is, would you rather have someone that is under muscled, right? So whatever proxy measure we're using, whether it's BMI, whether it's DEXA scan, whether it's we measured their body fat, BIA, whatever, right? But we've got a measure that's like, this person is a little bit under muscled for what we would like to see in our our little charts, right? But they're really strong, right? Relatively speaking, they're really strong for themselves. They're strong. Any measure, they're a strong individual, right? Would you rather that, or would you rather someone that is really well muscled, right? So they are like top in the charts, like they have a whatever fat-free mass index of like 25 or whatever, like the natural limit is supposedly supposed to be, whatever. They're literally top in the charts. They're really well muscled, but they're kind of a bit weak, like they're just not very strong. Like if you're to like even just compare like a squat or something, like they're just very middle of the pack, not like nothing to write home about, right? Now, obviously, the two individuals are training, right? They wouldn't have got these outcomes otherwise. Let's assume they're training relatively similarly, but the outcomes that they get from the similar programs are vastly different. Which, in your opinion, at least, or at least your science-informed opinion, is a more important, or a more, I don't know what you would say, a healthier, maybe, individual? Which would you rather be?
I'd rather be the genetic freak that has both, the higher muscle mass and strength, but then wouldn't everyone? I think like, to genuinely answer the question, I think you realistically see that, you do realistically see that there are stronger correlations between muscle function, so muscle strength, and health outcomes, longevity, than there are necessarily with muscle mass. And there are a few reasons for that. So we do know that, like, people can have similar sized muscle, or as measured by a DEXA, but they can have different levels of strength and different health states. And the reason for that is because of the structure of the muscle. So for example, when I talk about what is a healthy muscle, we're talking about, I don't know if you've ever seen an MRI cross-section of a thigh muscle or something like that, you'll see what, the muscle area is always nice and dark black color. You'll have a little layer of like subcutaneous white fat around it. And that's pretty much it. You'll see the bone in the middle, okay? That is a good, healthy muscle because we are seeing that solid muscle mass. There's no infiltration of fat within that muscle. We do know that in individuals who have poor metabolic health, so for example, people with type 2 diabetes are a very, very good example. We see something called intramuscular fat infiltration. So that's muscle that develops within the tissues of within the muscular tissue. So if you look at a cross section of their muscle, it's not one solid black mass. You will see little, basically kind of rivulets of fat that are going throughout the muscle. And what that does is that actually impairs muscle function significantly. A muscle like that can't contract as powerfully as a muscle that doesn't have that level of fat infiltration. And there's also, again, back to the chicken and the egg scenario of, is it the effect of the exercise or is it the effect of just the muscle size? Exercising regularly is going to reduce the risk of having that fat infiltration. But it's also going to make you stronger. So I think it's just a good indication of all-round health when somebody has a strong muscle, whether it's a large or not. If it is strong, it is more than likely quite healthy, and it's an indication of somebody who's been training regularly. So yeah, to answer the question, I think strength is probably a better indicator than muscle size of health.
Fantastic. And when I always describe the like intramuscular fat, I always describe it as like you go in and get a steak and you ask for a steak that's like really well marbled. You're like, okay, you see it, you see literally fat in the whole like muscle bit. It's not exactly the same, but that's basically intramuscular fat there, right?
Have you ever had a Wagyu?
I haven't, but I heard it's quite delicious.
So I used to live in Japan, and where I lived in Japan, a place called Miyazaki, it was actually famous for producing some of the best Wagyu in Japan. And I remember distinctly the first time I walked into a supermarket, and like, here in our, I say here in Ireland, I'm in England at the moment.
I'm in England, so like we're
we've been excommunicated already. But like you go into a supermarket and you go to the steak section and you'll see like a nice steak that you or I would normally go for. It's probably not going to be hugely marbled, okay? But you're going to see a big red section. That's the muscle mass with a cap of fat over it, okay? Normal. If you get something like a ribeye, you'll see little lines of fat going throughout it, but it's still going to be mostly red with that line of white fat going through. When I was in Japan and I saw Wagyu for the first time in my life, I had no idea what I was looking at, because one, it's not red. It is the lightest pink color with, it is predominantly fat. You just see this mesh, this net of white fat with these tiny little pink areas in between. And it's phenomenal. It is delicious. It melts in your mouth. Like I can't describe how good it is. But those animals are not healthy because they are being overfed. Like that's like the foie gras of muscle meat. Those animals are being overfed phenomenal amounts of like rice and other grains to be put into a state that they don't get a huge amount of exercise. They apparently get massages. That's BS because I've seen where they're raised. But yeah, they're not particularly healthy animals. And I would not like my muscles to be like that. I would like my muscles, to be nice and dense and relatively free of intramuscular fat if possible.
100%. And also, I'd like my muscles to be really, really red as well. And that's purely by virtue of having lots of mitochondria and lots of good vascularization and blood flow to them. That's my personal preference anyway.
That's going to be the next flex, that I like. So look at how red my muscles are.
But anyway, so long story short, you're saying that the more important thing is to be strong versus being big. However, you can't really separate the two, and ideally, why not both?
Ideally, why not both? And remember, there's a massive genetic component to it as well. One thing that I didn't get to say about, when we were talking about like that appendicular lean mass, I forgot to mention it, and I should really mention it. It's not appendicular lean mass on its own. It's appendicular lean mass index. So it's that. So we all know that body mass index is your what is it? Weight over height squared. So that's the same thing. It's your appendicular lean mass, your muscle mass over your height squared in relation to your height. Because, for example, you could find somebody who's got, they're 5 foot tall and they've got, let's say, their right arm has 3 kilos of muscle. And you could find somebody who's 6 foot tall and their right arm has 3.2 kilos of muscle. So you can say, oh yeah, their appendicular lean mass is higher, but they're also a foot taller. So they've actually got a lot less lean mass in relation to their height. So that's another aspect that's really, really important. You can't just take these raw numbers and say, okay, this number is better. We need to compare it to something else as well.
Yeah, 100%. And this is also why if you're taller, it visually is harder to look like you have more muscle. At least that's my excuse anyway. I'm just absolutely jacked out of my mind, but because I'm 6'5", it's fucked. I just look skinny always. But anyway, that's a side tangent. The next thing that I want to kind of go on to is, and this is something that it's kind of it's really hard to parse out. So I'm gonna give you some time, right? Why do we lose muscle when we get old? Is this just a foregone conclusion? Is this just a function, like we're all, me, you, everyone who's ever born, everyone who will ever be born, we're just going to reach a certain age and muscle is just going to start falling off our body, right? It's just going to start deteriorating, right? Like we all know we're going to have to die, right? Well, there's a non-zero probability that I'm not going to die. This is a universe, and it's, again, probability. I potentially am going to live forever. But anyway, that's a side tangent. Most of us, I'm just built different. Most of us are going to lose muscle as we get older, right? Is that just a foregone conclusion? Or is there a way to potentially stave it off? And even if we do all the stuff to, like, we do everything right, we're doing our resistance exercise, eating enough protein, etc., are we still going to just, slowly, fall off a cliff? Or what's the story there, basically?
We're all doomed. We are all doomed. Okay, so my area of research, like I said, is muscle and heart health. A big aspect of that is something called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia is the progressive loss of muscle mass as we get older. And just to kind of give people an idea of what this even means, as I say to them, like, if you're in your 30s right now, think back to when you were a child and think of maybe a grandparent or somebody who was older than you, and then think of them as you got older yourself. More than likely, they probably got a little bit smaller, a little bit more frail, a little bit decrepit. And that's kind of an example of that loss of muscle that we see over time. They're losing muscle mass, they're losing mass, they're losing strength. And it happens to a lot of people. And it's only recently been kind of accepted as, a proper diagnosable condition. I think it was as recently as 2017 when that happened. And why does that happen? And we'll kind of get onto, is it inevitable? So there are a few different reasons for it. And I will say that the main reason, at least the principal reason that people start losing muscle is because of inactivity as they get older. So as you get older, it is almost expected for you to start doing less. It's like, you've worked hard for the last 50 years of your life. You can start taking it a little bit easy now. And I think that's terrible advice, because
we often actually make it harder for older people to maintain muscle mass. Like, you'll always do stuff like, oh, I'll carry those bags in, those groceries in for my granny there, because I'm a good grandson. I just do that for you. But it's like, you kind of actually want to let her struggle because that's what's actually keeping her muscle mass.
There's a nicer way of saying that. Yeah, you want granny to get her daily dose of exercise. Absolutely. No. So when we get older, we stop being active, and that activity, the exercise, is the actual stimulus that we need to maintain muscle. Because muscle is not going to hang around for, just like, he looks good with a little bit of extra muscle on his body. Muscle is only going to be there if you give it a reason to be there, and that reason is exercise and movement. And as people get older, they walk less, step counts drop, they do less heavy lifting because they're not expected to, and they get weaker over time. And that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. So I genuinely think exercise is the main, or lack of exercise is the main contributor to loss of muscle. Another thing is that as people get older, is they tend to suffer from more conditions that will put them into hospital for a short, or have more hospital stays. And what we have in that case then is something called a catabolic crisis. So when somebody goes into hospital, they're usually in bed, and they could be in bed, let's say, for a week. And if they're in bed, they're not doing any activity at all. And we know that even short bouts of immobility like that, or bed rest, can cause massive drops in muscle protein synthesis, massive drops in insulin sensitivity, and very, very sudden drops in muscle mass. And some people will say that when an older person loses that amount of muscle mass so quickly, they don't necessarily regain it all back as soon as they get out of hospital. So that catabolic crisis is that moment that they're in hospital for a week, and then they don't regain all of their muscle back, and then they kind of gradually lose a little bit over time, and they go into hospital again for whatever happens to them, because old people tend to go a little bit more regularly. And people, I've heard this, and this is purely anecdotal, but like you'll hear, they were never right after they went to hospital that time. And you hear it so much because somebody will get, knocked down, not knocked down, not literally, but they will get knocked back. They'll be in hospital for a while. They'll have lost a huge amount of muscle, and they won't be able to continue with their life as they did previously. And they never get back to those levels of strength or muscle mass that they had before. So it's a genuine risk. So yeah, older people tend to lose because of lack of activity, but there are other reasons for that as well. And as people get older, we have the development of something that's known as anabolic resistance. And anabolic resistance is basically a resistance to the normal stimuli that we have for muscle growth and muscle maintenance. And those two main stimuli are exercise, that we just mentioned, activity, and protein intake. So we know that protein can stimulate muscle protein synthesis as well, especially after exercise. And what we see is that in older people, if we want to stimulate muscle growth, and to measure how we do that, we measure something called muscle protein synthesis. If you give an older person 20 grams of whey protein, that older person will have, actually, let's start a different way. If you give a young person 20 grams of whey protein, you will very close to maximally stimulate their muscle protein synthesis. It gets to a really, really high level. If you give that same dose to an older person, when I say older, somebody in their 70s, you might get half that level of muscle protein synthesis. Now, you can rescue that by giving them more protein. So if you give them, if you double their protein intake to 40, it can actually get quite close to the younger person's level of muscle protein synthesis. So that's an aspect of anabolic resistance, is people just don't react as well to protein, but they also don't react as well to exercise. So older people may need more intense doses of exercise to get the same effects that a younger person would get. So it is actually quite difficult for older people to build muscle. But we also see that anabolic resistance itself seems to be less in people who maintain exercise throughout their lives. So people who have been exercising from their youth all throughout their life up to old age, they don't suffer as much anabolic resistance. So they're able to build muscle, or at least maintain muscle, with less effort than somebody who has never done any form of activity in their life. And they're probably able to get away with eating slightly less protein than somebody who's never done any exercise over their life. And this again goes back to just saying how important activity is as we get older. Like, not only does it help us maintain muscle mass, but it also makes it easier for us to maintain muscle mass as we get older as well. But then on top of anabolic resistance, and probably within that umbrella term, we've got increased insulin resistance as people get older, and that can again be down to lower levels of activity, higher levels of fat accumulation within the muscles, which actually reduces our ability to process insulin, and then increases in things like I mentioned anti-inflammatory cytokines earlier. So increases in pro-inflammatory cytokines, so which have the opposite effect and actually increase levels of inflammation. They can increase the catabolic or breakdown process, and that can increase levels of muscle breakdown as we get older as well. Lower levels of sleep, because older people tend to have a reduced sleep as they get older, and we know sleep is incredibly important for helping to maintain muscle, helping to build muscle, helping to keep things like cortisol levels low, and we know that excessive cortisol on a chronic basis can reduce our muscle mass. What else can get in there as well? Oh yeah, appetite as well. We know older people, they tend to have some of them have lower appetites, and that means that they're eating less protein. They're not able to stimulate muscle growth as much as possible. So all of these things can contribute to that loss of muscle. And one thing that I've mentioned in seminars I've done before, and like I've kind of done a diagram of it for my PhD as well, is something that I call the sarcopenic cycle. So what you have is you'll have these older people who will lose a little bit of muscle mass. And when you lose that little bit of muscle mass and strength, moving is not as easy anymore. Okay, because like if your body weight stays the same and you lose a little bit of strength, it's not as easy to go out, it's not as easy to climb up the stairs. So you're probably going to do a little bit less of activity. So your activity level drops. You may gain a little bit of body weight. Okay, if you gain a little bit of body weight, if you're gaining body weight in the form of fat, that makes things even harder again, because you've got reduced muscle mass and you've got this increased level of fat, which is going to make moving even harder. So you're going to reduce your activity levels even more, which is going to lead to more reductions in body weight, in muscle mass, and more reductions in strength. And you've got this horrible vicious cycle where you're just getting weaker and you're not moving as much, but you need to be moving more to stay or stop yourself from getting weaker. And it's the sarcopenic obese cycle, really. But people get into that and it just continues. And this is why we see this sudden decrease in muscle mass in the population from the age 55 onwards. Is people start to fall into that sarcopenic or sarcopenic obese cycle, and it just snowballs. And it's we need to talk about what people can do about it, but at the end of the day, it's just keep moving, really.
Yeah. And this I have a question in this, and it's actually I don't really want to ask it purely because I actually don't want to know the answer, but for our loyal followers, listeners of the podcast, of course, I'm going to ask it. It's basically, if we're exercising, right? Let's just say, like me, for example, right? I exercise, well, maybe not a bad example because I do a sport as well, but let's just assume just resistance training and some cardiovascular training 5 times a week, right? If I maintain that for the rest of my life, you're saying here that there's not, maybe anyway, look, we can't speak in absolutes here, but I'm probably going to see less of an issue with this steeper drop off. There's obviously going to be some drop off. I'm not expecting to be as strong as I am at 30 as I am at 65 or whatever, right? But we're still doing well, right? I'm still training away, etc. Right? So if I continue to exercise, that's clearly a better position to be in, right? Okay, there's no controversy around that. But what happens to the person that has never exercised, right? What happens if you just, you've been working away, you've had a really busy job, you start exercising at 65? Have they already lost years of their life, right? Now, I never want to discourage people from exercising. I think exercising just in and of itself is a benefit. Just get out, move, do whatever. But has there been let's call it too much insult by virtue of not exercising, right? For those 65 years, you're oh, I just retired, whatever, the retirement age is 67 or whatever. So you just retired and you're right, I've really wanted to do this the last while. I'm going to get into some exercise. I'm going to do some work, right? Have we got to a stage, and maybe you might talk about the anabolic resistance thing, what's actually causing that? Because this is one of the things I have a bit of a question around. I'm is it some sort of DNA methylation where it's the epigenetic signals or the things that have led to the epigenetic signature that you've been putting in the quote unquote wrong inputs, and now they've created we'll call it an epigenetic signature that is less conducive to building muscle, building strength, building cardiovascular fitness, whatever, right? So have you fucked it from not training, not doing all these healthy habits for the 65 years? Or is there just a case of, I don't know what you want to call it, accumulated cell damage? Let's just put it like that. There's misfolded proteins, which is, it's kind of coming from a genetic signal. But anyway, there's proteins aggregated, your cells don't work as well. You have less mitochondria because obviously you haven't been exercising. You have all these different things at a purely cellular level that just make it harder to effectively turn on the protein synthetic machinery, right? So basically what I'm asking is, for those of our listeners that are potentially delaying exercise or delaying getting physically fitter, physically stronger, physically more muscular, whatever, are they taking years off their life? Or is it a case of, look, maybe, but the only answer we have is to get out and move anyway?
Jesus, you ask long questions, you know that. Right. Okay. Look, I think I'm going to preface this with the good old prevention is better than cure.
Yeah.
Okay. It is like we don't have enough research on like individuals who have not exercised throughout their life and then hit their 60s and decided to become lifelong exercisers from there on. We don't have enough research or enough data that we can give any concrete advice based on that. But we can say that those who do exercise throughout their lives, they're going to be healthier. It's simple as that. But it's not like, I'm not saying at all that if you've managed to avoid exercise up until your 60s, you're fucked. I'm not saying that at all. I know for a fact from the research that I do with my populations that we can get benefits, at least in the proxies of muscle mass and strength. And if we're getting benefits there in muscle mass and strength, we're going to get some other benefits further down the line, be it like with insulin sensitivity, and then hopefully, depending on how my research turns out, like with other cardiometabolic markers as well. But there is a time component to health, and there's a time component to, I think you might have said cardiometabolic assaults. Okay, so for example, we do know like that if your cholesterol is elevated for years and years and years, that is going to have a major effect on your health, and it is potentially going to take years and years and years to undo that damage. And it's sometimes it's not even possible, even with statins or something like that. Same goes for the kind of damage that would be done from assaults on poor blood glucose control. If somebody's not looking after themselves and they've been living with diabetes for years, their body is going to be kind of the worse for wear because of that. But it can still improve after it. But do you want to like redo a car that has been through the wars, or just drive that car really, really safely around the wars and avoid like the really shitty roads, so it doesn't have to go in for repair, at the end and cost you an arm and a leg to fix? You want to look after it as you're growing up with the car. You don't want to damage it actively. So yeah, that's why exercise is important. But kind of onto like what you mentioned about like epigenetic changes. I think epigenetics and exercise, it's going to be an absolutely fascinating area. I really think it is. Like we do know that exercise does cause some epigenetic changes in certain genes, and I think it's going to be something that we'll have to research. It's not being looked into hugely at the moment, like as in what's the effect that it has on anabolic resistance, and is it because of epigenetics? Like purely speculatively, I would say it absolutely could, and that would be something that we should look into more. Is it because you're exercising more, you're keeping certain genes more active that help maintaining muscle mass, make it a little bit easier? Like I can't wait to see more research on that, but I can't give any conclusive answers now, unfortunately, because you just don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, because I tend to think of it in terms of the same way you would think of like LDL. You're like, okay, lower for longer seems to be better for health. Okay, so with muscle mass, strength, and all that kind of stuff, I kind of think of it as more for longer is probably going to be better for health. However, I don't have like, I often worry for myself from like a whatever purely selfish thing. I'm like, am I just going to hit the 75? Because it seems to be 75 is the age that people like consistently start hitting that kind of functional decline. Would you agree with that?
For some people, it can be even earlier. But like, yeah, I think after their 70s, you see people like, people having a massive increase in what would be defined as frailty, although frailty doesn't have a proper definition at the moment. But yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One thing I just want to touch on, just because I thought of it there as you mentioned it, with muscle size. I know we're spending this conversation talking about, yeah, bigger muscles better. None of this research into the health outcomes of muscle mass, none of this is done in bodybuilders or powerlifters. So we're not saying that you need to be absolutely jacked like Arnold Schwarzenegger levels to be getting these health benefits. We're talking within a normal population, just having slightly above average levels of muscle. And again, there was another study, and for the love of God, I can't think of the names of the authors, but they looked at muscle mass in relation to longevity and health outcomes. And obviously there was a point where the benefits of added muscle plateaus, and like you don't really get any more additional benefit above a certain point. Now, again, I don't have that paper with me, so I can't say at what point it happens. But it's like similarly with you know, if you look at body fat levels, you've got a nice, actually a U curve. If you have incredibly low body fat levels, you know, your risk of death increases incredibly, just as much as if you have very, very high levels of body fat. There's a nice little sweet spot in between. With muscle mass, it's not a U curve. It is like the more muscle you have up to a point, you're getting healthier. And then, like, you know, you don't need to really try and get much bigger muscles after this. It's just decreasing returns after that.
Yeah, and we actually talked about that in the last episode of the podcast. Not exactly the outcomes that you're talking about, but in terms of like the hours you spend per week exercising. Like it seems to be a case of, okay, if you hit the bare minimums, like the guidelines there, we'll take them as the bare minimums. That's why they're the guidelines, you know? So it's like you do those, if you like double them, I don't have the figures in front of me, but it's like basically if you double them, you still continue to see benefits. But once you start getting beyond that, it's like, okay, you get marginal benefits. You know, you're still getting a little bit of extra, but as you like quadruple, like septuple or whatever it is, it's like you're probably going to fall off a cliff where you're just more likely to get injured. You're more likely to run into all these other issues. So it's not a case of, oh, I'll just do more and more exercise, you know? And it's the same with muscle mass and whatever. It's like, yeah, there probably is additive benefit. Like, let's just assume, like, if you're someone that is still within the, again, we'll call it the natty range, like you're still natural, you're not taking any exogenous hormones, whatever, right? But you have absolutely maximized your muscle mass. Let's just say, assume you did it in a healthy way. You're not just like doing whatever crazy fucking interventions, whatever. You did it over the last 15 years. You just consistently stayed, good diet, good health, etc., right? And you've absolutely maximized it. Like there probably are additive benefits than someone that's just like, okay, I've got the bare minimum muscle or the quote unquote normal level of muscle, right? But obviously, as you get closer and closer to maximizing this, you're probably getting less and less of a return on investment, you know? Like it's the same with learning a language. Like you get to like 80-90% quote unquote fluent, you're pretty good to go. Like,
and then you stop caring, and it's like, I don't need to work on the accent that much, or you know, who needs to conjugate that verb, you know?
Exactly. Like, and people even do this with their like native tongue. Like there's definitely words in English that I'm like, I don't know what that is. Like you have to look that up, you know? So it's like no one is actually ever 100% fluent. Like no one can pick up the dictionary and go, I know every single word in this, you know? And it's the same with like muscle mass and all these outcomes. It's like, okay, this closer and closer we get to this like limit, like this physiological limit, like you're probably getting less of a return on investment. And probably speaking, like, or in reality, I mean, like to do the things that you need to do to get closer and closer to that, it's probably just not worth it in your real life. Like if you have to train like 2-3 hours a day just to get closer, to inch off that little extra, you know, cubic centimeter of muscle, it's like you've just given up like 3 hours of your day, and you could have got or maintained that muscle with just 45 minutes of work. You know, it's like there's a functional drop off in terms of the return on investment, you know?
Absolutely. But with that as well, like, and it's just because of the society that we live in, most people have not, I want to say this in a nice way, less than optimal lifestyles. Okay. They have poor diets and they have very, very poor exercise habits, if they have any exercise habits at all. So if you go to, let's say, the average Joe on the street who doesn't really do any exercise, and that is the average Joe, the average person does not do any exercise, and you suddenly get them into the gym 1 day a week, that is benefiting their health. To be honest, like you could have people, you know, as long as they're staying active every day, you could have them in the gym twice a week, and I'd be relatively happy with the strength and muscle mass benefits they would get from that. Now, can you do a little bit more and get more benefit? Yeah, probably. Can you get to a point where, you know, it's just pointless doing anymore because, you know, the benefits are, it's just, again, diminishing returns? Of course, absolutely. Find what you enjoy. Like, you know, if I get to a point where like at the moment, like, let's say I think I'm lucky if I get into the gym 4 days a week at the moment. If that gets boring or I don't like it anymore, then I'm going to do less. And if it gets to a point where it's like, oh yeah, you know, I'd like to do an extra day, I'll do that because it's fine for me. I use the gym to de-stress. But if for somebody, they go into the gym and it's like, yeah, 3 days a week is really my max. Any more than that, and I'd start resenting the gym. That's fine. You're at this sweet spot there. Go with that. Don't worry about getting huge. And like, you don't even need to get like a natty bodybuilder level. Like, genuinely just have more muscle than the average in the population, and you're doing fairly well.
Yeah, 100%. And like you said, like most people, they're under muscled and over fat, right? And that's obviously a direct outcome of the lifestyles they lead. Now, again, some of that is just outside of their control. It's just, we have to do what we have to do sometimes. It's like if you live in a poor area and you've no access to gyms, you've no access for good food, whatever, it's like your outcomes versus someone else's outcomes are going to be different. But either way, when we're talking in this more theoretical framework, ideally, I would just like to see people with more muscle. I think everyone's health would improve. Like, we always do this thing where we talk about the like obesity crisis. I'm like, why don't we talk about the under muscle crisis? I'm like, if everyone, I don't care, you might disagree with this, but I'm like, if everyone just stayed the exact same body fat, I don't care what body fat you are, 30% body fat, 12%, 40%, 50%, I don't care, right? And everyone increased their muscle mass, I do not see how we would not improve people's health. I'm like, that would, in my mind at least, purely by virtue of the fact that you have to exercise to do that. And then I think muscle is very like cardioprotective, metabolic health improves. Like, there's so many, as we've talked about, there's so many benefits to this. I'm like, if everyone was just more active and built more muscle, like, health would be in a much better position. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
I don't think you're going to find many people who are going to object with the idea that if everybody exercised a little bit more, they'd be doing better. Yeah, they probably would.
Which kind of brings me to our, we'll call it our next and final question, unless you have anything else to add to the discussion. And this is, what are you personally doing right now? You obviously mentioned there where you're like, oh, I'm training like, 3 times a week, maybe if I can get 4 in, happy days, but like, whatever, 3 to 4 times per week, you're good to go with your presumably resistance training, right? But what are you doing training wise, nutrition wise, lifestyle wise, right? And I want you to just think about what you're doing now. Now, obviously, look, you're a busy person, you're a busy man. It's not like we're talking ideals here, right? But you're busy, you're doing all this stuff. Contrast what you're doing now and then what you think, like projecting that into the future. Let's assume like you still enjoy the process, etc., right? Is there anything in your mind that you're like, oh yeah, I'm definitely, when I'm getting older, I'm going to start doing a bit more of this, or, I'm going to drop out this, or maybe even on the diet front, are you going to go, okay, well, as soon as I start getting a bit older, I'm actually just going to increase my protein, or like, what's your thought process contrasting now? So first of all, what are you doing now? And then contrasting that with what do you plan on doing in the future? Now, obviously life gets in the way, et cetera, but this is a theoretical timeline.
Good opportunity to speculate. So what do I do now? At the moment, like I said, about 4 days a week, 5 if I don't have a huge amount of other things to do. Into the gym for about an hour, a little bit more, and I like to do full body movements as much as possible, routines as much as possible, just because I like to get multiple opportunities to stimulate muscle growth / maintenance. Now, I'm not actively aiming for muscle growth right now because I'm just trying not to get too fat, because I spend a lot of time in front of a desk at the moment, and not a huge amount of time doing physical activity outside of the gym or outside of my work. So into the gym, I focus on a lot of compound movements, and then I'll throw in a few isolation movements as well. I do like to try and focus on some strength movements. So I'll do squats. I'll kind of go through cycles of sometimes where I'll be focused on more hypertrophy stuff and stuff where I'll be focused more on strength work, because I do think like just focusing on strength work is not specific in let's say in the context of powerlifting. It's not important for health to be able to squat 200 kilos, but I enjoy trying to aim for something more, like I want to increase my bench press, I want to increase my squat, I want to increase my deadlift. It's a fun activity, it's fun to aim for a while, until I get sick of it and I realize, I'm weak, I'm never going to be like the big boys, and then I just go
the
back
weights start getting heavy and they're like, fuck, this is actually just sore.
yeah, it's like, oh, my joints are falling apart right now, So that's what I do, and I like to I like to change it up regularly. Well, when I say regularly, every 6 months I like to try a new routine or something like that, just because I think you need to stick with a routine for long enough to see some of the effects of it. But it's also nice to add in some novelty to your training as well, just from a psychological perspective. As I get older, what am I going to do? Do you know what I want to do more of now is I want to do some more aerobic work, specifically to improve my aerobic capacity. I'm going to see if I can get a VO2 max test here done in LJMU, just to see what my current level is, which is going to be pretty much abysmal, because the only cardio I do is very, very steady state. So cycling to work and cycling to see some of my participants in different parts of Liverpool at the moment. And I want to kind of get back into a bit of running, just because I think human beings, we have adapted to an upright gait, and I think we're adapted to running, and I think it's something I would like to be better at. And if it ever comes to it, it would be nice to be able to escape if I ever need to escape quite quickly from a bad situation. So yeah, I'd like to run a little bit more, and it gets me outside more, which I don't do enough of at the moment. So that's what I would like to do.
You're up north of England, so rainy. It's coming into winter.
Oh man, may as well be back home, like, to be honest, in Ireland. But yeah, the weather's getting crap at the moment. And then in terms of protein, yeah, I may increase my protein intake as I get older. So like I'm already, people will know me as a researcher who spends a huge amount of time talking about protein, and obviously I have a fairly high protein intake, but it is nowhere near as high as some people might assume. I don't think protein needs to be, ridiculously high, but I may increase it as I get older if I notice any decreases in muscle mass. And then there's also like the consideration as somebody gets older, should I get some assistance with this? And this is something that I've genuinely not put a huge amount of thought into, but I have in the back of my mind is open to the thought, would I ever need to get like testosterone replacement therapy as I get older? I don't know. I'm not the kind of person who would say, oh, steroids, never do that ever. Like, for let's say for athletes, physique athletes, if somebody wants to take steroids and if they want to get huge, that's absolutely fine. I have no problem with that, as long as they're absolutely open and transparent about it, and they're not hiding it, or they're not saying that no, I'm not taking it at all, which I think is even worse than hiding it. But if somebody gets older, we do know that a lot of anabolic steroids were originally designed for medical purposes, for people who were spending huge amounts of time in bed and were losing a lot of muscle mass. And there may be some cases for older people where some sort of assistance, be with testosterone or other substances, whatever we may have in a few years' time, it may be warranted. Now, it's not the kind of thing I would say, yeah, everybody should be doing that. Absolutely not. Like, that's a massive decision to go on to TRT. And it's actually something I want to talk about in future podcasts with some other people as well. As just I want to know more about it, because obviously a lot of my clients are older individuals and they want to know what they should be taking. I don't think anybody I think people can get huge amounts of benefits from just eating well and exercising, and that will give huge benefits. But there may be situations where people could benefit from some sort of assistance. I don't know enough about it to give a huge commentary on it, but I like to be open to all potential kind of therapeutic aspects or therapies that are out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I suppose like that, it's an umbrella term of like, right, you're saying TRT because that's obviously what we would think of now, but who knows in 20 years time, 30 years time, what fucking exogenous molecules the pharmacists or pharmacologists, I should say, have cooked up, and they're like, you know what, actually this one is going to give you these effects, whatever, So like yourself, I'd be fairly open to that as I age, but there is also this little niggling thought in my mind where I always think, I'm like, is this a case, like, say we often see like that functional decline in testosterone as men age, but it also kind of is the same question we were just asking about the muscle mass stuff, where it's like, is this just a foregone conclusion, or is it a case of lifestyle changes, inactivity, people don't maybe get their enough vitamin D because they're not going out into the sun, or like they're not doing all of these different things? Is it a foregone conclusion that you're going to be on lower, or you're going to have lower testosterone, or is it a case of you just do all of the inputs that you should be doing, and as a result your testosterone is in a fantastic place, you know? So it's one of those things where I'm like, chicken or egg, what's the story?
Well, there was a great review paper that was released, I'm going to say early this year or late last year. I did a video on it for My Protein, and they were talking about lifestyle modifications that one can do to increase testosterone. Okay, and they were talking about things like not having an overly low-fat diet or calorie-restricted diet, doing resistance exercise, getting a wide variety of different minerals into your diet. And at the end of the video, I just literally said two things. If you are living a healthy lifestyle, you already have all of these factors covered. Getting enough sleep was another one. And these should be the cornerstones of your lifestyle if you're trying to live a healthy diet. You should be exercising, you should be doing resistance exercise, you should be sleeping well, you should be getting a wide and varied diet, not deficient in any particular nutrients. That will ensure that your testosterone levels are healthy. But that is only going to give you testosterone levels within a normal physiological range, which is not going to give you the benefits of the super physiological doses that somebody is going to be taking if they're taking exogenous testosterone. So like some people will read this paper and say, okay, I need to do this, 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 and this, and I'm going to be jacked like Arnold. No, you're not. You're going to be a normal, healthy human being. Be grateful for that. If you want to be jacked like Arnold, do what Arnold did. It's not necessarily illegal. Okay. So yeah, not that I'm saying anything about the great Arnold, but
yeah, it is important to know, like, obviously there's a difference between physiological and super physiological, you know. But I think most people are aware, and obviously if we're talking about testosterone replacement therapy, like there are some other, we'll call it caveats, that are specific to muscle to a degree. Like we often see an increase in sex hormone binding globulin as someone ages, right? We often see that in a normal, you know, free living human. As they age, you see differences in these other hormones that potentially signal cascade, basically increase sex hormone binding globulin. Whereas if you supply exogenous testosterone, you basically, this is not completely accurate, but you're basically going to lead to a higher percentage of that being free testosterone, right? So you're actually, and depending on your pinning frequency, your administration frequency, I should say, like you can manipulate that even further, right? But you could basically get to a situation where you have low sex hormone binding globulin, which isn't actually associated with great health outcomes, but it is actually associated with great muscle gain outcomes, right? So like it is a completely different situation. Someone having, like, let's just say whatever, 500 nanograms per deciliter, because I measure in nanograms per deciliter because I read a lot of American stuff. Or like if you have 500 nanograms, if I could even speak, 500 nanograms per deciliter as a natural person versus 500 nanograms per deciliter, even like synthetically given, like exogenously given, like it's still going to be different. Because if you have your natural 500 and you have a poor night's sleep, or you're like, oh, you know what, I want to have that glass of wine or whatever, like all of that stuff's going to interact with your testosterone because you have to produce it. Whereas if all you have to do is load up that pin and barrel and go, boom, I've administered my testosterone, like obviously that's completely different. So there are functional differences in that. And bringing it back to this conversation, like if you do fully care about like health, longevity, you kind of have to have all this stuff on the table. You know, you have to be like, right, is this something? You have to be able to talk to your doctor about this stuff. Now, people will take from that and go, oh, I'm 30, I'm 32. I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not a spring chicken anymore. Do I go on that TRT? Like realistically, I would rather see someone just clean up their lifestyle, their diet, all that kind of stuff first and foremost. Like that's clearly the baseline intervention. And we're realistically talking about TRT and all that kind of stuff when you're like 55, 65, 75, like older age.
So one thing that's scary with this is, and like I don't look into this a huge amount, but one thing that is scary is kind of the development of TRT clinics in places like the States. And these are basically just places that have a doctor that you can have a phone or even maybe an email consultation with, and they will prescribe you your TRT. They'll say, okay, talking about looking at your symptoms, I would say that you've got low testosterone, you're suffering all the side effects. We'll give you TRT, and this is for young guys in their early 20s, And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. This is it's a major conversation that somebody needs to have, because it's not all, unicorns and rainbows and gummy bears. There are going to be some negative side effects as well. Okay, and it's like with women, like women going onto HRT. It's a major decision to make. Now, it's also looked at a lot more socially acceptably, as well. But there are other things to take into consideration when a woman is going. It's not just as easy as saying, okay, woman is now menopausal, put her straight onto HRT. There's a lot of things to take into consideration, and that's where a doctor and a proper consultation and a proper conversation about the pros and cons and everything is really, really important.
That's even important, like just talking about HRT, like people do it with their, like, whatever, 12, 13-year-old daughter, where they'll go, oh, you need to be on the pill because of whatever, they'll do that. And it's like, this is something that you actually need to discuss. Like, you have to do like a proper case history, like there are side effects to that, like blood clots, for example. Like, I know so many women that have had, like, actually had blood clots as a result. Well, you can't really purely pinpoint that, but they were on the pill, got blood clots. That's one of the side effects of being on the pill. So it is one of those things where any medical intervention, like, you have to weigh up the pros and cons. There is absolutely no biological free lunch here, like, you're not getting something for nothing. So
with anything, and not even with a medical intervention, I think the really important thing to say that is everything that we do in life, there's a pro and a con to it. Like even with exercise, loads and loads of pros. The con, less free time. For an example, it's still something to take into consideration. Yeah, this could go down a serious tangent.
Oh yeah, so we could go all day. But anyway, look, I think that covers the majority of what we want to cover. Unless you have anything else to say around muscle mass, strength, longevity, health, whatever.
The only thing I'll say is, like, if somebody is not doing any exercise right now, doing anything is better than nothing. Okay, like, and like, I'm sorry, like, if they're listening to your podcast, this is not going to be the people we're talking about, but getting people moving more is probably one of the most important things that we can possibly do, from a cardiorespiratory perspective, from a musculoskeletal perspective. Our bodies were designed to move. We need to move more, and we don't, because of the society that we live in right now. Like, I'm here, like, luckily I'm not sitting down right now, I'm standing, but like, I've still been standing in one spot for the past hour and a half or however long we've been talking. Not feeling great about that, but that's the kind of society that we live in, and it's easy for people to just spend like 8 or 9 hours a day sitting in front of a desk and then come home and spend another 5 hours on the couch.
100%. So get active, get moving. It's literally what we're designed to do. Like, I don't think that's a controversial statement.
None of that. We don't do those statements.
Anyway, look, we're going to wrap it up here. As per usual, guys, you can find all the links to everything below. I'm not going to, take up 20 minutes of your time going through an exhaustive list of where they can find us and everything. However, having said that, because I know some people listen to this and then they just completely X out of it, they don't read anything. Where can people find you? Where is the best place to get in contact with you? What services do you offer? All that stuff. This is your time for a selfless, or selfish, I should say, plug yourself, marketing, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, I'll keep it easy for everybody. I'm over on Instagram. It's Be More Nutrition, or you can just search my name, Richie Kirwan, and I should pop up. If you want my OnlyFans, oh wait, sorry, wrong. Yeah, college has been hard, man. I got to pay those fees. But yeah, come over to Instagram. I'm over there. Drop me a message. I do coaching with people. I work with a lot of people with cardiovascular disease, but I work with a lot of people who just have general physique goals and health goals as well. And yeah, come say hello.
Fantastic. Anyway, guys, we will see you in the next one.